Welcome back, everybody, to the Campfire. Tonight's episode, I had a lot of time to think about what I wanted to focus on for this particular episode. Since my last one, where we talked about UFOs and abductions and aliens walking around my hometown of Pine Bush, New York. If you haven't checked out that episode, you can check it out on YouTube, Spotify, or anywhere that you listen to a podcast. But tonight is a little bit different. Tonight, we're going to be talking about where I live currently, which is San Antonio, Texas. I think a lot of people don't realize that San Antonio is essentially a graveyard, a city built on top of a graveyard. And whenever I bring this up to locals who potentially have been here, several decades, family members haven't left, they all defend why we're here. And I, being a non native to this particular area, I just can't see it that way. One of the most famous stories of San Antonio is the Alamo, of course, where we fought to secure San Antonio and Texas. And I think a lot of people forget that so many people died during the fight at the Alamo. And the city was essentially built around that area of San Antonio. I've been to the Alamo several times, not really because I wanted to. Let's just start right there. It's pretty boring. It's 1,000 degrees out usually in Texas. So the Alamo is, of course, a very old building, and majority of it is not air conditioned. So those are all ideal conditions for me to stay the hell away from that. But when I do go to the Alamo, I get this feeling of being watched, and I get this feeling of being guilty almost. It feels like guilt for me anyway. And while I'm not going to be talking about the Alamo in particular, I do want to address the fact that we are built on top of a mass grave of people dying in wars and dying from colonization. And a lot of people like to forget about that particular history of San Antonio, which is unfortunate because a lot of this area was built on the backs of people that were not wanting to help build up a city. This particular story that I have learned about since living here, I actually drove past this creek several times when I first moved down here, going to work. And while I did drive during the day most of the time, there were some instances that I had to drive back from work late at night when I closed the store. And I never knew why I felt so uneasy driving on this road. And then I learned the story of Hollering Creek. Hollering Creek is the origin story of La Llorona, which is, if you don't know, an urban legend of a woman in white getting people to stop and ask if she's all right and taking them, killing them. And this particular instance is believed to be the first instance of La Llorona, and it's quite interesting to learn the history behind of why people feel this way. Um, like I said, when I drove past this area, there was one particular night that I will never forget. I had closed the store. I was coming back around 9:30 at night here, and it was raining. It was downpouring. And my headlights kind of reflected off the water on the road because San Antonio is unfortunately known for very poor drainage on the road. So we experience a lot of flooding, and my lights were reflecting off the road. And when I crossed over Hollering Creek, I felt this presence that didn't necessarily feel sinister, feel angry, which when I get to the story of the woman at the Hollering Creek, you'll see why it should feel like that. And I like to think that at the time I was pregnant with my oldest, that maybe it was because I was pregnant and she, the woman, also had children. And that's why she left me alone and didn't give me that feeling of dread and anger. But I did feel something that felt not safe. And the story goes that the woman who sits at Hollering Creek was an indigenous woman of the area. They were called the Payaya people, and she had an affair with a Spaniard who had settled here. During the 18th century, the Payaya people essentially were wiped off the map. And they did that by stealing all of their cattle, and the people went into and the group of people went into extreme poverty, which led to people dying of famine, people dying of disease. Of course, as we all know, Europeans brought diseases that natives had never seen before. And this particular woman had an affair with a Spaniard, had 2 children by them, and it's believed that the children passed away and that, of course, the mother passed away. There's not really a record of how. It could have been from famine, it could have been from disease, it could have been from her taking her own life, but there is no actual documentation of what happened to this particular woman who stands at Hollering Creek waiting and bawling and crying for her children and crying for her lover. So when you drive by this road, there's nothing but trees. It's a very wooded area, and then there's the creek and the tiny little bridge that goes over it. You could probably blink your eye and miss it, but at night is when things really do change, and when something a little bit more sinister is out, because that's when La Llorona actually comes out to try and lure people off the road. Have I ever seen anything? No. Aside from that one trip where I felt something off, I've never seen a woman standing on the edge of the road sobbing. None of that. But it just feels like she doesn't want somebody like me to perish from her. And I can't say that, a man's perspective would change that. I don't want to test that theory out and send one of my guy friends or even my husband to drive past that area to see maybe if I'm wrong. But it just shows how tragic the history was of this area, and that this woman did die as a result of colonization, and she mourns that. And I don't necessarily believe in Casper the Friendly Ghost or anything like that, but I do think that when we pass away, depending on how we pass away, we leave these energies behind. And our energies replay what we were when we passed away, almost like a record player. And if you look behind the science of ghosts and paranormal activity and entities, you see that there is scientific evidence to back up, almost like a VHS tape replay of the person's last moments. And I remember reading about that when I was very young. And mostly I read about it because, as you all know, my mother passed away when I was 3. And I had several ghostly encounters. I hate to call it that because I don't feel like it was, but I had several encounters with energies that I believe were my mother's. One in particular was right after she had passed. Our cat, his name was Frisky, our cat was in the living room, which he was not supposed to be in the living room. My mother made sure of that when she was alive. And She used to hit him with the broom to get him out of the living room. I know it sounds awful. I don't really think my mother was a animal person. She really tried, but I don't think she was. But she would hit him with a broom to get him out of the living room. And our cat walked into the middle of the living room, looked off into the dining room, flinched as if he was being hit, and bolted out of the living room. And there was another instance, and I talked about this in a past podcast. There was another instance that I was in my bedroom, and when I was growing up, I had a lofted bed, and the lamp was like off to the side of my lofted bed. And I was doing homework at my desk under my bed, and something told me, or something felt like somebody was watching me do my homework. And I had known that I was by myself, which is majority of my childhood. I was left by myself. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing behind me with a trench coat. And my mother owned a light brown trench coat. It was a different time. I would never wear this now, but she owned a light brown trench coat. And I couldn't say if the trench coat was a light brown because the figure was a dark figure. It was just a dark shadowy figure. But when I turned to look at this figure fully, because I knew out of the corner of my eye I could see this person, when I turned to look, the trench coat almost swooped like a cape and the figure disappeared into nothing. I still to this day see that figure, and I'm a firm believer that that is the energy of my mother still lingering on this plane of existence. And I think that the tale of Hollering Creek is very similar in that this woman died tragically, and the energy that she let out when she died lingers on that bridge and lingers by that creek, just trying to tell her story. And at night, while we all sleep comfortably in our beds, in our homes that were built on top of hundreds of thousands of bodies, you can't help but wonder who died and who is lingering where I sleep at night. Next time on Campfire Chronicles, we'll be taking a look at some other stories in San Antonio, Texas. Specifically, we'll be taking a look at the Alamo and the Mission Church in San Antonio, as there's so many stories that I know revolve around the paranormal. But until then, my friends, stay safe out there, and I'll see you here back at the campfire.